Hi everyone, this is Professor Smith, and this is going to be a little tutorial on how to interpret either a monopoly graph or a graph for a monopolistically competitive firm in the short run. So what we're trying to do in this unit is figure out what is the right quantity to produce, that's going to be on the horizontal axis, what's the right price to charge, and then how much profits are going to be earned. So just a quick little review. A monopoly is the sole seller of a product. There's going to be few close substitutes, and that monopoly is going to be able to have barriers to entry to keep out other firms from entering and selling that same product. A monopolistically competitive firm is in a competitive industry, so there's a lot of sellers, so that's very different from monopoly, but the firm is able to differentiate its product. And what that means is that at least in the short run, it's able to exercise some pricing control and act a little bit more like a monopolist and earn some excess profit. Okay, so this graph applies to either a pure monopoly or a firm in the monopolistically competitive situation in the short run. Now, first, let's take a look at the graphs. All right, so to make this decision about quantity and price, you need to estimate the demand for your product, and that's the line D. Notice how it's got the standard shape. Notice how though there's no supply curve here. The firm simply needs to know its marginal cost structure, so that's going to be this upward sloping curve here. So remember, marginal means incremental. So let's take a look. The first million subscriptions costs this firm, if I just simply go up and look at the graph, incrementally, $10. The second million the second million subscription, that second million cost the firm $20. All right, so marginal cost is looking at incremental cost of the next unit or batch of quantity produced. Now, every firm needs to also track its average total cost, and we learned last week that that kind of has that U shape, and we can see it's kind of got that U-ish structure here. And the fourth curve to know is your firm's marginal revenue. All right, so marginal again always means incremental. So again, let's take a look at the first million subscriptions. If I go up to the green line, and I read off the graph to the left, I'm incrementally earning $80 each on the first million subscriptions. Okay, if I go to the second million subscriptions, that second batch, and I go and look up, I'm earning, it looks like a little under, whatever that number is, a little under $70 per subscription. Okay, so again, marginal, the M means incremental. Now here is the rule of thumb. The first question we want to ask is, what's the right quantity to sell? What's optimal that's going to maximize your profit? And here's the rule of thumb. As long as your marginal revenue exceeds marginal cost, that unit is going to be profitable because you're going to be bringing in more revenue on that unit or that batch of units than you're going to be incurring in cost. So if that's true, then you should produce that quantity, produce that unit or batch, and produce more, right? Consider producing more and keep producing because you're earning more in terms of marginal revenue than it's costing you. Let's go and take a look at the graph, put that idea into some meaning here. Let's take a look at the first million subscriptions. Suppose your boss says, hey, let's only sell exactly 1 million subscriptions. You would say, all right, my marginal revenue, go up to the green line, is 80. That's way above the marginal cost. Go to the blue line and look at the graph. The marginal cost, if I look at the graph on the left, is only $10. So I'm bringing in 80, but it's only costing the firm 10, right? That's incremental profit of 70 per subscription there. So I'd want to keep selling more subscriptions. Now let's suppose the boss says, all right, well, more is better. Let's try to sell, I'm just going to make up a number here. Let's try to sell 5 million. You would say, okay, let's go to the graph over here. Here's 5. The marginal revenue looks like it's about a little bit under $20 a magazine. But what about the marginal cost? That's way up here. That looks something like almost $60 a magazine if I go off to the graph on the left. So I'm actually losing money on a per unit basis when I try to sell those 5 million magazines. So that's too many. Well, if we think about that, algebraically, it's the opposite of what we just looked at. In other words, if marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, you're producing too much. So you'd want to reduce the amount that you're producing. Well, if you think about it, that only leaves one state of the world left, and that's where marginal revenue is exactly equal to marginal cost. And that's going to be the optimal production to sell. So let's take a look at the graph again. I want to look where my marginal revenue curve, so that's the green line, exactly intersects the marginal cost curve, that's the blue line, and that's going to be that point right there. Now here's where students make a little mistake, and that's why you're getting the benefit of my screencast here. You don't want to go and look at the price on the left. You're going to use this cross point here to identify the right quantity. So it looks like in this graph it's about 3.6 million subscriptions. Okay, so the first part, to answer the question, the optimal for quantity would be 3.6 million subscriptions. Now the second thing we want to answer is what price to charge. Now here the most common mistake is just to go and look at the graph on the left. But you want to capture as much as you can. The demand curve specifically tells you what's the highest price that you can charge to sell the quantity that you want. So I don't want to go to the left here. I want to go all the way up to the demand curve to capture as much price as I can. So I go up to this point here. Now I read the graph off to the left. So I'm going to be charging exactly $70 per subscription to sell the 3.6 million that I want. Okay, so the second part, the optimal price, so P for price, would be $70 per subscription. Now the last thing that we're going to look at is how much our profit. Now that we learned two ways to calculate profit. The base way is to take total revenue and subtract off total cost. That's the core definition. Another way that I can do it, which is algebraically exactly the same, if I take the price I'm going to charge, okay, and I subtract off the average total cost at that price, that gives me essentially my per unit average profit you could think of, and I multiply that by the quantity, the optimal quantity, algebraically those two are actually the same. Okay, and you can just kind of take my word for that. All right, so let's take a look and apply that again on the graph, and then algebraically right here. All right, so if I go back and look, here's our optimal situation. Here's our 3.6 million subscriptions. Here's the $70 that I'm going to charge. The equation tells me I want P minus ATC. All right, so here's my price, 70. Now if I just simply, to get the ATC, I want to simply drop my I down to where the ATC curve is, and then read that value off the left-hand side. So in this case, it's 60. Okay, so P minus ATC is this height here. The Q is the 3.6 million, that's this distance here. So if I simply multiply that, it's actually just this rectangle, right? Because I have a height times a base, right? So if I multiply those two numbers, I get the area of this rectangle. Okay, so let's do that algebraically. So in this example, the price I'm charging is 70. I'm going to subtract off the 60, and again, remember that you have to read off the graph unless you're given a table of numbers. and I want to multiply that by the 3.6 million units or subscriptions that I'm going to be selling, and I believe that works out to be 36 million. And although I won't waste our time trying to prove it, there's actually no other price quantity combination on this entire graph that will get you to a profit better than 36 million. Okay, so that's the simple framework that you can use every single time to solve a monopoly or a monopolistic competitive graph. The only other thing I'll point out real quick is this kind of pinkish, purplish triangle. That's what we call in econ buzz speak the deadweight loss. And you could think of that as essentially the lost value to society as a whole as a result of the fact that this monopoly is charging a high price and restricting the number of units that it wants to sell. So in other words, if we were trying to think about societal well-being as a whole, we'd actually rather be at this point right here, okay? But we don't get there. The monopolist instead restricts quantity and charges a higher price. So we want to quantify then, okay, how much value to society overall is lost. And because society is being hurt, that's actually the whole justification for antitrust laws and government regulations of monopoly.